Okay, so this is part 2 of the sunflowers video, and we are now going to paint. So the key for this background with the watercolor is really just going to be secondary, meaning that I'm just going to add really light values. So in order to do this, I'm going to use the wet on wet technique. So I'm just using plain clear water from my water cup. And I'm just going to go through, add regular clear water. And to make this process a little bit faster, I'm using a larger brush. And so this allows my brush to not only hold more water, but also to cover more surface. And to avoid the paper from drying out or the water from evaporating, I'm just going to do small sections at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and do just yellow background. So I now have a little bit of yellow paint on my brush. And I'm just applying that paint to the background that I've painted. Basically just kind of moving it around. And so I'm going to use this technique throughout the whole painting. And so what we're going to do with this painting is we're going to use regular colored pencil on top of the painting. And with that colored pencil, we're going to add a lot of texture. And so the purpose of the watercolor for this particular painting is that the watercolor is really just going to provide a background, basically to fill in all the little tiny white gaps that the colored pencils can't always get unless you just press really hard and go over it several times. And so while I'm using a large brush right now for the areas that are really small or maybe a little bit more difficult to get to, I'm going to use a smaller brush. So the paint brushes are always going to have a number on them. For example, this is a number 8 brush. The larger the number, the larger the paintbrush. And so for a lot of these small areas, I'm probably going to use a number 2 paintbrush because it'll be small enough to get some of these petals, some of the stems, any other details I'm wanting to add. Sometimes I can get these small areas with this number 8 paintbrush. It just takes a very steady hand, takes quite a bit of practice too. So if you're not real comfortable with your painting skills quite yet, I would use a smaller brush and hold the brush on the metal. That's where you'll have the most control. Just filling in some of these small spaces. And like what we've done with our other paintings is it's always going to be best if you paint back to front. So right now I'm doing the background, which will be this wall area behind the flowers. And then I'll move into my middle ground, which would include my tabletop or floor surface. Can't really tell exactly what it is. It would also include the flower pot. And then all of the details on the flowers, the seed pods, the stems, the leaves, the petals, that would all be last. So in a way, it's kind of like an order of operations for art or painting. Just kind of makes things easier for you. You may notice once I'm putting my color on the paper, I just kind of dot it in one area, then basically just use my paintbrush to move the color around, allow it to shift around. All right, so I have the back of the right side of the painting done, so I just need to look at the left side. And another thing I'll want to consider once I start working on other areas of the painting, I don't want my colors to run. I don't want them to, once I start painting my table surface, I don't want the color to run into my wall area. Now, that's only if the paper is still wet, which you can see the water on my paper right now. So I would want to wait until my wall is done before I jump into my tabletop. So in order to really maximize my time, I would paint areas that don't touch the background. So for example, there's like this top part of the flower pot that I'll go to next. Because whenever using this wet on wet technique, whenever you add clear water, the paint is going to try and run wherever that clear water is. Wherever you stop painting with clear water, the paint will stop. Just one thing to keep in mind as you're working. And once I notice my colors are starting to get maybe a little too light, I'm just really running out of color on my brush. I'm just picking up more of my yellow on my paint palette. Starting to get to a point where a lot of these areas are maybe a little too small for this larger brush, so I'm gonna have to switch my brush here in a second. So now I'm gonna move over to my number 2 paintbrush. So this one obviously is quite a bit thinner than that number 8, but still gonna use the same technique, just painting water first, pulling some color, dropping it in. And so since this brush is a lot smaller, it doesn't hold nearly as much water. So I'm just having to jump back and forth between paint and water more quickly than what I did for the larger paintbrush. Just to double check some areas, make sure I didn't miss anything. Some areas over here I need to get real fast. Just a few more spots that I missed. So it's really easy to miss some background areas, especially when it's really small and detailed. So just look for that, just plain white paper, and you'll be able to kind of see areas that you may have missed. I think I got everything now. So now I'm going to move on to, so this area is still a little wet down here. So I'm going to do the top part of this flower pot next. And I'm going to stick with my #2 brush. So for this area, I'm just going to set down plain water again. And this part of the flower pot kind of has a almost like a mustardy type yellow to it. So it's not like a bright yellow. Has a little bit of a brown. So I'm going to go over this first with yellow and then wash some brown into it. Now, another way I could approach this, rather than relying on my brown colored pencil, is I can just take a little bit of violet, paint it on top of this yellow, and the violet and the yellow will neutralize one another, and it'll make a neutral color. Not necessarily what we think of as like a true brown, but it'll have some brown tones to it. So I have a little bit of violet on my brush, mixing this in now. Paper's pretty wet, kind of shiny, so you may not see the full color effect until it's fully dry. It's like a grayish, brownish purple hue to it. Remember, anytime you mix two complements like red and green together, blue and orange, yellow and violet, they neutralize. All right, so my background is still a little bit wet. So I am going to paint the insides of the flowers. So just getting a little bit of water on those, and I'm going to do a yellow-green. Dotting that yellow-green into the areas that are wet. So I still have some yellow-green watery paint on my brush, so I'm just going to go directly on top of these areas. Touch that one up just a little bit. So I'm just going to follow the colors in the original painting, but you don't necessarily have to. So this one has some like light blue. Just this one flower. And then this one has kind of a reddish, almost red violet color to it. A little bit more red instead of just that red violet. Test my paper. So my background's getting, it's more dry, not entirely dry though. So I'm just going to look at other areas that aren't touching that background or the centers of the flowers. So this area is pretty dry. So I'm going to go ahead and just paint the tabletop. And since this is a larger surface, I'm going to go ahead and just use my bigger brush. Straight, plain water. And this tabletop surface has that kind of brownish hue to it. So I'm going to just really take the same approach I did for the top part of the flower pot, where I get yellow, just regular old yellow. maybe try and get it a little bit brighter than my background. So I'm just using quite a bit more paint than what I did for the background behind the flowers. Now I'm going to get some violet. My palette's running out of my violet color. So if that happens, scribble more violet colored pencil or whichever color you're running out of on your paper. I'm just painting the violet on that yellow tabletop surface, trying to mix it around a little bit so the colors are mixing properly. You could also take yellow, scribble it on your paint palette, scribble violet on top of that, and that'd give you the same color effect also. Again, this is just really going to be a background color, and we'll take some colored pencil on top of it. All right, so I'm going to let that dry for just a second, and we'll come back and do the rest of the flowers. All right, so all of my background is now dry. So I'm going to add color to the seed pods, and I think I'm going to use a yellow orange. So same process, just painting with clear water and with a wet brush. Pick up some colors. Here's my yellow orange palette. So I'm going to just go through, add all my color. Yellow orange on top of these seed pod areas. And again, we want to make sure that the colors stay pretty light, so that way when we add our colored pencil, the colored pencil will stand out, and we'll have the hatching or cross hatching or whichever value technique you use. I'll probably use some hatching and maybe a little bit of stippling on some of these seed pods possibly. And that way there's a nice contrast between the watercolor areas and the colored pencil. And so once we do this, we're just going to use normal colored pencil for a couple of reasons. It'll be a little bit darker than the watercolor pencils. Really in darkness, it'll be about the same, but we'll have a much wider range of color than if we were to just use our watercolor pencils. So I'm going to use one of the 36 color sets, and that'll allow my palette of color to be a lot more varied. So after I paint these seed pods, go in and paint this, the bottom of the flower pot. And then by the time I paint that, I can come back in and paint the stems and the leaves, because the seed pod area should be fairly dry by that point. one last one, it looks like. There we go. Now I'm going to paint the bottom of the flower pot. Same technique, just using straight up plain clear water. Flower pot. And I think for this, I'm going to go back to my yellow orange again, but try and make it a little more concentrated with color so that makes it a little darker or brighter. Not too dark, so that way my colored pencil will stand out against it. Okay, so that is done. Now I'm gonna go ahead and paint the stems. So once we get to these areas that are pretty small, just take your time. And remember, if you hold your paintbrush on the silver part, it allows you to be a little more accurate with your color and really kind of get painted in the lines. This is a leaf, so I'll go ahead and paint that one too. Oop, missed one seed pod though. There we go. That's back to my stems. A little more green in that one. So to get these really small, fine areas, if you hold your paintbrush, which is more straight, if you can kind of see the end of your brush rather than the side, it allows you to get some of those sharper, finer lines with the plain water. And then I'm just really kind of touching those areas with my brush, and not so much using like a normal paint stroke, but or brush stroke. It's almost like I'm just kind of stippling water in some of these places. Another leaf, like that. Where else? Here's another one. And I believe this is going to be another leaf. And we'll just add some green leaves up top here. A little bit of green on these upper parts of the flower. Right, so I think I got all of my green areas. So really all I have left are my flower petals. So with these, I'm just going to use straight up yellow. And with the background, I use wet on wet. So I wet the paper first, used wet paint to get this color. For my petals, I'm going to allow these colors to stand out a little bit more. So I just have a wet brush. And then I'm just picking up my yellow paint and my paper is dry. So these areas where the petals are, that paper, I have not painted with plain water yet. So I'm really doing this just because it'll allow me to have a little bit more control. That way I don't risk putting too much water down. These areas are pretty small. Oop, missed one green stem. Ironically, it's the green stem that Van Gogh missed in that original painting. So my yellow on my palette was getting a little washed out. Didn't really have too much left. So you can see these yellows are a lot more intense and bright than what I was doing up here because it just wasn't quite yellow enough. It wasn't quite bright enough. Again, it was just because my yellow was running out on my paint palette. There we go. That looks better. So if you run into that, you probably just need to refresh your paint palette. It's going to work a lot better if your paper is fully dry. And then you can just paint your, or scribble your new watercolor colors on top. Or if you're kind of in a rush, you can just scribble some up to the side where the paper is dry. So just about done here. Just have a few petals left on about half the flowers. And right now you can see that the painting looks, it's nice, just kind of boring though. It's just a bunch of flat color. There's no real interesting texture to it. Don't have really any changes in value, so that kind of takes away from the interest also. But once we put our dry colored pencil markings on it, it'll really stand out. So once I get to the dry colored pencil markings, I'm going to start with my background first, since that is completely dry. And by the time I'm done with it, I should be able to move into these petals and some of the other areas that I've been painting more recently. Into some really small areas right now. I have almost all my petals. I did miss a stem right there, so I need to go in and add some green to that. I think that's the last part I have. One tiny stem. All right. So I'm pretty much done painting on this painting. I just need to use my colored pencils now. So I have my set of 36, and I'm just going to do my background first. So I'm going to use a couple different colors here. I'm going to use an orange, yellow, lighter yellow, and kind of a yellow orange. And when you do this, think about the different textures you can add to make it look interesting. If I just did kind of normal hatching, it's not too interesting. I can do these Van Gogh-esque swirls and spirals. could do these all around paper, but really the key is that I really want to fill this background space. So you can make patterns, you can just kind of make random marks or lines, hatching, cross hatching. It's really up to you how you add color to the background. But really the main thing is, this is starting to look pretty interesting, but if I go in with additional colors, maybe putting them next to some of these marks that I did, or overlapping them a little bit, it'll make the painting overall more unique. Especially if you're using a variety of colors. So, I have this orange, which is pretty bright. The yellow orange I was using is a little bit darker, has a little bit more of a muted tone to it. And another thing you can always do is if you use just a regular white, it's almost like a mixing tool. So if I just grab a white, see what this does. Oh, I'll go over here where I might use some of these other colors. And sometimes it shows up, it's going to show up more on like darker colors, like your violets, maybe your reds, blues, greens. Not really showing up too well right here, so probably not going to use too much of the white on that part. Now, the key thing for this, though, is you need to make sure your paper is fully dry. So even damp, if the paper still has a little bit of moisture to it, these marks won't be nearly as vivid or bright. So you just want to look out for that. Now I have a bright yellow. And while this may not stand out on its own, next to some of these other colors, it just adds a little bit of extra texture. So remember, even sometimes when we do small steps or things, it may not seem to make a big difference at first, but in the grand scheme of things, it will add to your artwork. Looked at that when doing our pencil drawings, especially with the portraits. Big spiral, little spiral, another big one down. Switch things up. All right, so I'm going to fast forward a little bit. We'll jump to where I'm working on like some of the petals and the seed pods, since you probably see a pretty good approach for the background. So we'll just jump ahead right now. All right, so I have my background done now. Add some textures to the table. So I have this darker yellowish orange, or almost like a mustard color. And now I'm just using hatching. So I'm just going side to side or in a horizontal direction. Works. And now I have what is kind of a brown with more reds in it. Start kind of making these wavy lines. Another brown, pretty similar, just slightly different in value. So really, once you start adding these colored pencil marks, the key is to use variety. So really with the variety in color. So I can even introduce this, this looks like a brick type red. Not going to use too much of this though, but just a little bit. Add some kind of red accents to the table. All right, there we are. So the lower part of the base is dry now. So I'm going to use this color, and since this is basically a cylinder, it's kind of a red orange. I want these lines to curve, so that way it'll look like it's separate from the table. So basically just curving these lines like you would when adding value to a cylinder. Go over it with some yellow. We'll go back to this kind of mustardy yellow. All right. Now the upper part, this is going to be darker, so I'm going to use kind of a similar approach like what I did for the table, but the same thing. I want to make sure that these curve kind of like what we have on the bottom. Short curving hatch lines. And go over it with different brown. Again, we want the lines to keep curving. And we'll add a little bit of that brick red accent color. Actually, this is that other brown. And we'll add that brick red accent. Not too much though. And then for the seed pods, I'm going to use a radial symmetry approach. So with these, I'm just going to use brown, and it's almost going to look like a bike spoke or bike wheel. So I'm not going to do all these on camera. I'll just do this one so you can see how I would do it. So has that flower type look to it. Go over it with another color. So I'm going to go back to that kind of darker red or yellow orange. And then go over it with another brown. Again, you can use any color you want. These are just the colors I'm choosing. But as far as like your hatching marks, I would go in kind of this radial symmetry approach. The center is kind of a yellow green. And since these are seed pods, if you do stippling or like real short hatching, that'll be effective for those parts, but mix up the colors a little bit. We can offset some of that green with maybe a little bit of light brown stippling. In the center, again, it'll just create some texture. For the stems, these are probably gonna be pretty small. So it's really hard to get a couple different colors down, but like in here, I was able to get some colored pencil markings. Just kind of brighten those up a little bit, especially if you press harder. Really bright saturated colors. Now in the areas like where the leaves are, probably can introduce a few colors. So right now I've got some greens. And this is somewhere where you can maybe bring in some whites. Creates kind of a tint to it, lightens it up just a little bit. So as you work on the rest of this painting and the rest of flowers and seed pods, we want to see not just colored pencil textures that stand out. They stand out against the rest of the painting and the watercolor parts, but use a variety of colors. That'll really enhance your painting. It'll really make it stand out. So an example you can see in this is this one that is finished. There's texture and value all throughout the painting. There's no just like flat plain areas of color. Some of the leaves kind of look like it on screen, but there is some other values in there. Or of course you can go in with a white and add a lighter value to some of those. And then when you're finished, you'll peel your tape, erase any remaining pencil marks, and you'll have a pretty sharp looking painting once you're done. Or mixed media work of art, really. Mixed media because we're using the watercolor. We used the color waterproof pen, and of course all of the color pencil marks. So that is it for the watercolor sunflower painting.